He was a man who had nothing left to lose, who gave everything he had to 3 children, who had no one. But what the world decided to give back in return would test the very limits of his soul, forcing him to confront the ghosts he thought he had long since buried. Before we delve into the heart of this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, and please subscribe if you appreciate stories that explore the depths of human compassion. The land held its breath in the moments before dusk, a stillness that had long ago seeped from the fields into the very bones of Elias Thorne. His farm was a testament to slow decay, a collection of tired wood and rusting metal sinking back into the earth from which it had been wrestled. The fences sagged like weary shoulders, and the paint on the clapboard house had been surrendering to the sun and rain for 2 decades, peeling away in pale, curling strips that resembled sunburnt skin. Inside, the silence was a presence, a heavy blanket woven from dust motes and memories. It was a silence he had once cultivated, a penance for the laughter and life that had been violently erased from these rooms. He moved through the quiet spaces with the practiced economy of a man long accustomed to being alone, his footsteps on the worn floorboards, the only percussion in a world devoid of melody. He had been checking the southern fence line, a pointless ritual for a man with nothing left to keep in and nothing to keep out. When he saw them, they were not children at first, but shapes. 3 small, dark figures huddled together at the edge of the woods where his property dissolved into untamed wilderness. They were as still as the ancient oaks that shadowed them, their forms stark against the bruised purple and orange of the dying day. He stopped, his hand tightening on the splintered handle of his axe. His first thought was of trespassers, of vagrants, but there was a fragility to their stillness, a vulnerability that snagged on the rough edges of his solitude. He did not call out. The air was too thin, too sacred for a human voice. He simply watched as the light faded, his own breath a small white cloud in the cooling air. They were children. He could see it now. Small, so terribly small against the vast, indifferent landscape. They were black children, a detail that hung in the air with a weight he could not yet comprehend, but felt in the tightening of his gut. In this part of the country, in this time, their presence here, alone and at his doorstep, was not just an anomaly. It was a spark cast toward a field of dry grass. He could turn back. He could walk into his silent house, bolt the door, and let the darkness swallow them. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. It was what the world expected of him. But then, one of them, the smallest one, shivered, a tremor that seemed to travel across the field and into his own chest. It was a movement of life, fragile and desperate. It was a reminder of another small body, racked with a fever he had been powerless to stop. The memory was a physical blow, a ghost's hand on his shoulder, pushing him forward. He let the axe fall to his side and began to walk, his heavy boots crushing the frosted grass. Each step a decision, a surrender to an obligation he did not understand and did not want. He was moving toward them, and away from the hollow peace he had so carefully constructed. The silence of his life was about to be broken. The house did not welcome them. It was a space consecrated to grief, and their presence felt like a profanation. They stood just inside the door, 3 small statues carved from night and fear, their eyes wide and absorbing the foreign geography of the room. The stone hearth cold and black, the single armchair with its worn indentations, the faded photograph on the mantel of a smiling woman, and a boy who would never grow older. Elias felt a profound and suffocating awkwardness. He was a man of the earth, of tools and seasons, not of children. Especially not these children whose silence was a wall he did not know how to breach. He gestured toward the kitchen table, a clumsy, aborted movement. "Sit," he said, his voice a rasp from disuse. They did not move. They only watched him, their collective gaze a heavy, judging weight. He tried again, his words feeling foolish and hollow in his own ears. "You must be hungry." He moved into the kitchen, the small space feeling suddenly cramped. He opened cupboards, the hinges groaning in protest. He found a can of soup, a half loaf of stale bread. As he worked the can opener, his hands, usually so steady and capable when mending a harness or sharpening a blade, felt clumsy and thick. The rhythmic grinding of the metal was the only sound, a harsh mechanical intrusion into the charged quiet. He could feel their eyes on his back, a constant, unnerving pressure. He thought of Martha, of how she moved in this kitchen with a fluid grace, how the air would be filled with the scent of baking bread and the sound of her humming. A flashback, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced through the fog of his present. Daniel, his son, perched on a stool, his small face dusted with flour, his laughter a bright, ringing bell. The memory was so vivid it made him gasp, a sharp intake of air that was almost a sob. He leaned against the counter, the cold metal of the can biting into his palm, grounding him. He had to push it down, push it all down. This was not then. That life was over. These were not his. He ladled the soup into 3 bowls, his hands shaking slightly. He set them on the table, the ceramic clinking loudly. He placed a piece of bread beside each bowl. The children still had not moved. They were rooted to the floorboards by the door, their hands clutching each other, a small, defiant unit. The oldest, a boy of maybe 10, stood slightly in front of the other 2, his expression a mask of stoic mistrust. A girl, a few years younger, peered out from behind him, her eyes shadowed and ancient. The youngest, a boy no older than Daniel had been, simply stared, his face a blank canvas of shock. Elias retreated to his armchair, a strategic withdrawal. He sat down, the familiar cushions sighing under his weight. He did not look at them. He looked at the cold fireplace, at the ghosts that danced there in the dim light. He had brought them in from the cold, but he had only brought them into a different kind of winter, a wilderness of the heart. The soup grew cold on the table. The bread remained untouched. The house held its silence, but it was a new kind, now shared between 4 people, thick with unspoken questions, with fear, and with the vast, desolate space between them. The journey into town was a descent into a familiar kind of hostility, now sharpened and aimed directly at him. Elias had always been an outsider, the quiet farmer with the tragedy clinging to him like burrs, but he had been a predictable, ignorable part of the town's fabric. Now he was a spectacle. He felt the shift the moment he guided his old, sputtering truck down Main Street. Windows seemed to darken as he passed. Porch conversations fell silent, heads turning to follow his progress with a unified, piercing gaze. It was a gaze he knew well, one that judged and condemned without a single word being spoken. At Miller's Mercantile, the bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful, mocking jingle. Mr. Miller, a man whose face was a permanent scowl held in place by suspicion, stopped stocking a shelf and watched Elias approach the counter. His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, flicked past Elias, out toward the truck where 3 small shadows were visible through the dusty glass. "Thorn," he grunted. It was not a greeting, but an accusation. Elias handed him the list. Flour, lard, salt, milk, things he hadn't bought in years. Miller took the list, his fingers barely brushing Elias's, as if he feared contamination. "Feeding extra mouths?" Miller's voice was low, laced with a derisive curiosity. Elias didn't answer. He just stood there, feeling the weight of the store's other patrons, their silent scrutiny prickling the back of his neck. He was a curiosity, a problem, a disruption to the town's carefully maintained, prejudiced order. Miller gathered the items with a deliberate, almost insulting slowness. When he came to the milk, he paused. "Heard you found some strays," he said, not looking at Elias, but at the cartons in the cooler. "Folks are talking." Of course they were. News in a town this small traveled faster than fire. It was a place woven together by whispers and assumptions, where everyone's business was a matter of public record, to be picked over and judged. Elias remained silent. There were no words he could offer that would satisfy the man's insinuations, no explanation that would be accepted. His silence seemed to irritate Miller more than any defense could have. The shopkeeper slammed the milk carton on the counter. "It ain't right, Thorn. You know that? It ain't natural." The final word was delivered with a quiet venom, meant to be the final, unassailable truth. Elias paid, his movements stiff. He gathered the bags, the thin paper crinkling under the pressure of his grip, and walked out, the cheerful bell mocking his departure. The walk back to the truck felt 100 miles long, each step taken under the heavy burden of the town's collective disapproval. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Brody's car kicked up a plume of dust as it rolled down the long drive to the farmhouse. Brody wasn't like Miller. He was a man of law, which, in its own way, was more dangerous. His prejudice was codified, given the weight of a badge and a gun. He leaned against his car, thumbs hooked in his belt, his posture one of casual authority. "Elias," he said, his tone deceptively friendly. "Just making a friendly call. Heard you had some visitors." The word was chosen carefully, stripping the children of any identity, reducing them to a temporary inconvenience, a problem to be solved. "They're just children, Sheriff," Elias said, his voice level. Brody's eyes scanned the property, taking in the sagging porch, the overgrown yard. His gaze was a silent inventory of Elias's failures. "Maybe so," Brody said, his eyes finally settling on Elias, cold and appraising. "But they ain't your children, and they ain't from around here. You understand what I'm saying? A man in your position, it raises questions." The threat was unspoken but clear. Elias was a man alone, a man with a past. In the eyes of the town, in the eyes of the law, his compassion was not seen as virtue, but as a symptom of something broken, something suspect. He was defying an unwritten law, and a price would be exacted. The cold settled deep into the house that night, a damp, penetrating chill that the old walls could not repel. It was a cold that seemed to emanate not just from the outside, but from within, from the small, silent boy shivering under a thin wool blanket. Elias found him when a small, choked cough broke the stillness. He had been in his armchair, not sleeping but drifting in a state of weary vigilance, when the sound pulled him to his feet. He walked to the room he had given them, Martha's sewing room, long unused. The two older children were asleep, huddled together for warmth on a makeshift pallet. But the youngest, the one whose name he still didn't know, was trembling, his small body curled into a tight knot. Elias placed a hand on his forehead. The heat was immediate and alarming, a dry, radiating fire, a fever. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow, throwing him back across the years. He saw another small forehead, another fevered flush, felt the ghost of a desperate, useless prayer on his lips. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in his throat. He had to fight it down, force himself to breathe. This was not Daniel. This was not then. This was now. He moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He retrieved a basin, filled it with cool water from the pump. He found old, soft rags in a chest where Martha had kept them. He returned to the room and knelt by the boy's side. The oldest child, the watchful one, was now awake, sitting up and observing Elias with an unnerving intensity. His eyes held no fear, only a deep, weary suspicion, as if he were waiting for the inevitable moment of betrayal. Elias ignored him. He dipped a rag into the water, wrung it out, and gently placed it on the small boy's forehead. The child flinched at the contact but did not wake, lost in the delirium of the fever. For hours, Elias kept his vigil. He changed the cloths, his large, rough hands moving with a tenderness he thought he had forgotten. He sat on the cold floor, the silence of the room broken only by the boy's shallow, rapid breathing and the distant hoot of an owl. The older brother never slept. He simply sat and watched, a silent sentinel guarding his family against a world that had given them no reason for trust. As the first pale hint of dawn touched the window, Elias felt a subtle shift. The boy's breathing deepened, slowed. The trembling subsided. Elias placed his hand on his forehead again. The fire had receded. It was still warm, but it was the warmth of life, not the searing heat of illness. A profound wave of relief washed over him, so potent it left him lightheaded. He had done something. He had fought back the darkness, just for this one night, and he had won. He looked up and his eyes met the older boy's. The suspicion was still there, but it was now mingled with something else, a flicker of confusion, of grudging acknowledgement. In that shared moment, in the quiet aftermath of the fever, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the wall of silence that had separated them. Elias saw him then, not as a nameless, mistrustful stray, but as a brother, terrified and fiercely protective. And perhaps in Elias's exhausted, patient care, the boy saw something other than a threat. He saw a man who had stayed through the night, a man who had fought for his brother. The fever had broken, and in its wake something new and fragile had begun to take root in the frozen ground of the silent house. The sun rose, casting long, pale fingers of light across the floorboards, illuminating the dust in the air like a galaxy of tiny, swirling stars. The house was still quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed. The sharp edge of fear had been blunted by the shared vigil of the night. Elias made breakfast, the simple acts of cracking eggs and slicing bread feeling less like a chore and more like a ritual. He set the food on the table, and this time the children came. They moved slowly, cautiously, but they came. They sat, the two older ones flanking the youngest, who looked pale but clear-eyed. They ate in silence, but it was a companionable silence now, the kind that can exist between people who have weathered a small storm together. Elias watched them from his armchair, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He needed to know their names. It felt like a fundamental necessity, a way to anchor them to this place, to give them substance beyond the shadowy figures who had appeared at his property line. To continue to think of them as the boy or the girl felt like a continuation of the world's dismissal of them. He had to try. He cleared his throat, and the small sound made them all look up from their plates, their forks frozen mid-air. "I have a name," he began, his voice soft. "It's Elias." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "My wife, her name was Martha, and our son was Daniel." He hadn't spoken their names aloud in this house for years. Saying them now felt like opening a locked room, letting in a sliver of painful, necessary light. He wasn't speaking to them, not directly. He was offering a piece of his own broken history, a gesture of trust. He pointed to the faded photograph on the mantel. "That's them." The children's eyes followed his finger. They looked at the smiling faces frozen in time, a family from another world. They didn't speak, but he saw a flicker of understanding in their expressions. They knew loss. They knew what it was to have ghosts. He looked at the oldest boy, the protector. "What's your name, son?" The boy's jaw tightened. He looked down at his plate, his small shoulders rigid. "Don't have names," he mumbled, the words almost inaudible. It was a lie, Elias knew. But it was a lie born of a deep and profound need for survival. To be nameless was to be invisible, to be untethered, to have nothing that could be taken from you. It was a shield against a world that had already taken everything else. Elias didn't push. He simply nodded, accepting the boy's defense. He had offered his own ghosts. He could not demand theirs in return. The room fell back into silence. But then, a sound, small and hesitant, broke the quiet. It was the girl. She had been watching Elias, her gaze thoughtful and less guarded than her brother's. "Lila," she whispered. The name was a tiny, perfect thing, a fragile bird taking flight in the heavy air of the room. The older boy shot her a warning look, but she ignored him, her eyes still on Elias. She pointed to her protector. "He's Samuel." Then she gestured to the youngest, who was now carefully pushing a piece of egg around his plate. "And he's Caleb." Samuel, Lila, Caleb. The names settled into the room, filling the empty spaces. They were no longer just shapes, no longer just strays or visitors. They were Samuel, the guardian, Lila, the voice, and Caleb, the silent survivor. The act of naming them was transformative. It was an acknowledgement of their existence, their history, their humanity. For Elias, it was a turning point. He was no longer just sheltering them from the cold. He was sheltering Samuel, Lila, and Caleb. And in the quiet morning light, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the fragile presence of his present, he felt the first stirrings of a responsibility that was heavier and more meaningful than he could have ever imagined. The black sedan that rolled up the drive a week later was as out of place as a raven in a flock of doves. It was clean, official, and utterly devoid of the dust and character that defined everything else on the farm. A woman emerged, her posture as rigid as the starched collar of her blouse. She carried a leather briefcase like a shield. This was Mrs. Albright, from the County Division of Family Services. Her presence was an immediate and profound threat, the embodiment of the bureaucratic world that existed beyond Elias's fence line. Her smile was professional and thin, offering no warmth. Her eyes, however, were sharp, conducting a swift and damning inventory of the scene. The peeling paint, the unkempt yard, Elias's worn work clothes, and the 3 black children who stood slightly behind him on the porch, their sudden appearance in this county an untidy problem on her desk. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. "I'm Eleanor Albright. We received a report regarding 3 unaccompanied minors on your property." She didn't need to say who made the report. It was the whisper of the town given an official voice. Elias nodded, his body tense. They needed a place to stay. Mrs. Albright's gaze swept over the children, her expression unreadable but clinical. She was not seeing Samuel, Lila, and Caleb. She was seeing Case File 734. "While your initial actions may have been commendable," she began, the word commendable sounding like an accusation, "this is hardly a suitable environment. The law has specific procedures for children in their situation." She wanted to come inside. Elias had no choice but to let her in. She moved through his house with an air of detached judgment, her polished shoes clicking on the floorboards. She noted the lack of modern amenities, the sparse furnishings, the pervasive sense of age and disrepair. To Elias, it was home. To her, it was a catalog of deficiencies. She sat at the kitchen table, opened her briefcase, and became the system incarnate. She asked questions, her pen scratching across a form. Where did he find them? What had he fed them? Where were they sleeping? Elias answered simply, his words sparse. He felt like a criminal under interrogation. The children had retreated to the far corner of the room, their silence a stark contrast to the woman's incessant questioning. Finally, Mrs. Albright looked up from her clipboard, her face set with a decision that had clearly been made before she ever arrived. "Mr. Thorne, the state has facilities for children like these, places where they can be properly cared for, evaluated, and eventually placed." The phrase "children like these" hung in the air, a sterile dismissive term that erased all their individuality. They'll be taken to the institution in Somerville until a more permanent arrangement can be made. The word institution landed like a stone in Elias's gut. He pictured a cold, gray building, a place of numbered doors and anonymous caretakers, a place where 3 siblings, who had only each other, would be swallowed by the system, their fragile bond broken. Something shifted in him then. The ambivalence, the reluctance, the weight of his own grief, it all fell away, replaced by a fierce primal instinct he hadn't felt since he had lost his own son. It was a white-hot surge of protectiveness that stunned him with its intensity. He had taken them in to quiet his own ghosts, but now, faced with the prospect of losing them, he realized that they had become more than a balm for his own sorrow. They had become his purpose. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it had the finality of a slamming door. Mrs. Albright raised an eyebrow, taken aback by his sudden resistance. "Mr. Thorne, you don't have a choice in this matter. You are not their legal guardian. Frankly, you are not a suitable candidate." "I'll become suitable," Elias stated, the words coming from a place of conviction he didn't know he possessed. He was no longer just a grieving farmer in a silent house. He was a man with something to fight for. The battle line had been drawn right across his kitchen table. The days that followed Mrs. Albright's visit were charged with a new, desperate energy. Her final words before leaving had been a clear ultimatum. "I'll be back in 2 weeks with the sheriff, Mr. Thorne. I suggest you don't make this difficult." 2 weeks. It was a lifetime and no time at all. The unspoken challenge galvanized Elias. He had been passively watching his world decay for years, but now he was at war with that decay. He wasn't just fixing a farm. He was trying to build a fortress, a sanctuary that even the cold logic of the state couldn't breach. He started with the fence that bordered the road, the one with the posts rotted through and the wire sagging like a tired spiderweb. It was the first thing anyone saw, a symbol of his neglect. He worked from sunup to sundown, digging post holes with a fury that left his hands blistered and his back screaming in protest. He was aware of Samuel watching him from the porch. The boy's suspicion was still a palpable force, a constant silent question. "What are you doing? Why now?" On the 3rd day, as Elias struggled to stretch a new line of wire, his muscles straining, Samuel came down from the porch. He didn't say a word. He just picked up the hammer Elias had left on the ground, walked to the next post, and began methodically driving in a staple to hold the wire. It was a small gesture, but it was monumental. It was an offering, a truce, An uneasy alliance was forged in the silence between the ringing blows of the hammer. They worked together, a strange pair, the grizzled, grieving white man and the wary, parentless black child. They communicated not with words, but with nods, with gestures, with the shared rhythm of their labor. They were two solitary souls, bound by a common threat, the faceless institution that promised to tear their fragile, burgeoning world apart. They moved from the fence to the porch, replacing the rotten boards that had groaned under Mrs. Albright's sensible shoes. Lila, seeing her brother working, began her own campaign inside the house. She found one of Martha's old aprons, and though it swallowed her small frame, she wore it with a solemn purpose. She dusted surfaces that hadn't been touched in a decade, her small hands wiping away the physical manifestations of Elias's grief. She even convinced Caleb to help, giving him a soft rag to polish the legs of the kitchen table. The house began to breathe again. The air cleared, literally and metaphorically. The scent of lemon oil and fresh sawn wood began to overpower the stale odor of sorrow. One evening, exhausted and aching, Elias found Lila in the small patch of earth behind the house that had once been Martha's garden. It was a riot of weeds now, but Lila was on her knees, patiently pulling them out one by one, clearing the space around a single stubborn rose bush that had somehow survived the years of neglect. It had one pale pink bud, tightly closed. "Mama liked flowers," she said softly, not looking at him. It was the most she had ever offered about her past. Elias knelt beside her, his large hands suddenly feeling clumsy and useless. He looked at the determined set of her small jaw, at the dirt smudged on her cheek. He saw the bud on the rose bush, a promise of beauty in the midst of dereliction. He realized then that they were all doing the same thing. They were all tending a neglected garden, pulling out the weeds of the past, hoping against hope that something, anything, could still be coaxed to bloom. A week before Mrs. Albright was due to return, the sky turned a bruised, menacing gray. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an oppressive stillness that mirrored the tension inside the farmhouse. A storm was coming. It wasn't just a storm of wind and rain, but a reckoning. It rolled in from the west, a great dark wall of cloud that swallowed the horizon and plunged the afternoon into a premature twilight. The first clap of thunder was a deep, resonant growl that shook the house to its foundations. The wind began to howl, a mournful, shrieking sound that clawed at the windows and rattled the newly repaired porch boards. Then the rain came, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that lashed against the house, blurring the outside world into a churning, watery chaos. Elias secured the last of the shutters and herded the children into the main room, away from the windows. He built a fire in the hearth, the first one in years. The flames sputtered to life, casting flickering, dancing shadows on their anxious faces. They huddled together on a blanket before the fire, a small island of warmth and light in the face of the storm's fury. Samuel sat rigidly, trying to project an image of bravery for his siblings, but Elias could see the fear in the tightness of his shoulders. Lila had her arms wrapped around Caleb, who was staring into the flames, his small face pale and still. Suddenly, a deafening crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, followed by an immediate plunge into absolute darkness as the power lines surrendered. The fire was now their only light. In the suffocating blackness, a small, terrified whimper escaped Caleb, then another growing into a heart-wrenching sob. "Mama!" he cried out, the word a raw, open wound in the dark. "I want my mama!" Lila hugged him tighter, murmuring soft, placating sounds, but the dam of his trauma had broken. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm raging inside the little boy. Elias felt a pang of helplessness. He was a stranger, an intruder on this sacred grief, but he couldn't just sit there. He moved closer, his large frame seeming to shrink in the firelight. He didn't touch Caleb, not yet. He just spoke, his voice low and steady against the roar of the wind. "I know, son," he said. "I know it hurts." And then Lila, her own voice trembling in the dark, began to speak. It started as a whisper, a story meant only for her brother's ears, but the telling of it filled the small space. She spoke of walking, of endless roads and dusty fields, of a mother who grew tired, who coughed until she couldn't breathe, who finally lay down under a tree and didn't get up again. Her story was fragmented, a mosaic of a child's traumatic memories, the heat, the thirst, the terrifying stillness of their mother's body. She told of how Samuel had led them, telling them not to look back, just to keep walking toward the setting sun. They had walked for days, hiding from cars, drinking from streams, until they saw the light of Elias's farmhouse, a single, solitary beacon in the encroaching darkness. Hearing the stark, unvarnished truth of their journey, of their loss, was like a physical blow to Elias. His own grief felt selfish and small in comparison. These children had navigated a hell he could barely imagine. He reached out in the darkness and his hand found Caleb's small, trembling one. The boy didn't pull away. He clung to Elias's fingers with a desperate strength. The storm raged on outside, but inside the small circle of firelight something profound had shifted. The secrets were out. The pain laid bare. In sharing their story, they had unknowingly invited him into the very center of their sorrow. And in reaching for Caleb's hand, Elias had finally, irrevocably, accepted that invitation. The day of Mrs. Albright's return dawned quiet and unnervingly bright. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, the air crisp and clear. But the pristine morning felt like a mockery, a beautiful backdrop for a looming execution. The farm was transformed. The fence stood straight, the porch was solid, the house was clean, and the single rose in Martha's garden had opened, a defiant splash of pink against the dark earth. But Elias knew it wasn't enough. These were superficial changes. The real change was in the invisible sinews that now connected the four of them, a bond forged in shared work and whispered confessions in the dark. He saw it in the way Caleb now stayed close to his side, his small hand often finding its way into Elias's. He saw it in the way Lila hummed as she worked, a ghost of her mother's melody. He saw it in the way Samuel's gaze was no longer just suspicious, but watchful in a protective, familial way. The black sedan arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, kicking up a small cloud of dust that seemed reluctant to settle. Mrs. Albright emerged, her face a mask of resolute professionalism. Sheriff Brody was with her this time, his presence a clear statement of intent. He leaned against his patrol car, his arms crossed, a silent enforcer of the system Mrs. Albright represented. She walked up the path, her eyes taking in the changes with a flicker of surprise, but her expression quickly hardened. It was an inconvenience to her narrative, a complication to a case she had already closed in her mind. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone leaving no room for pleasantries, "I hope you are prepared to cooperate today." Elias stood in the doorway of his home, the children clustered behind him like a small, vulnerable flock. He was not a man of many words, and he knew a grand speech would be useless against the wall of her certainty. He had to speak the only language he had left, the simple, grounded truth of their shared existence. "They have names," he began, his voice rough but steady. "They are Samuel, Lila, and Caleb." Mrs. Albright's lips thinned. "Their names are irrelevant to the legal procedure, Mr. Thorne." "No, ma'am," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "Their names are the only thing that's relevant. We fixed the fence, not because you were coming, but because it needed to be fixed. We cleaned this house, not to impress you, but to make it a home. We sat through a storm in the dark and we weren't strangers." He spoke of the fever, of the silence, of a rosebud. He wasn't making a legal argument. He was bearing witness. His words were plain, unadorned, but they were filled with the weight of the last 2 weeks. Mrs. Albright listened with an impatient stoicism, waiting for him to finish so she could proceed with the business at hand. "Your sentiment is noted, Mr. Thorne, but it doesn't change the facts. The law is the law. They are wards of the state. Sheriff, if you would." Sheriff Brody pushed himself off the car and started toward the porch, his face grim. The moment felt inevitable, a final, crushing defeat. But then, a voice, clear and stronger than Elias had ever heard it, cut through the air. "No." It was Samuel. He stepped forward out from behind Elias's legs and stood between him and the visitors. He was just a boy, small and thin, but in that moment he possessed an authority that dwarfed the two adults before him. He looked directly at Mrs. Albright, his eyes burning with a fierce, unassailable conviction. "We're not leaving," he said. His voice didn't waver. This is our home." As he spoke, Lila moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. And then Caleb, small, silent Caleb, stepped forward too, and he did something that sealed their fate. He reached out and took Elias's hand, his small fingers wrapping tightly around the man's calloused thumb. The three of them stood together, a united front. It was no longer Elias's fight alone. It was their choice, declared with a power that no legal document could refute. The tableau on the porch held for a long, silent moment. The world seemed to stop, balanced on the point of a child's declaration. Sheriff Brody had paused mid-stride, his hand hovering near his belt, his expression a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. Mrs. Albright's professional composure finally fractured, a small crack in her armor of bureaucratic certainty. She looked at the three children standing defiant, at the small boy clinging to the old farmer's hand, and saw not a case file, but a family. It was a messy, unconventional, and in the eyes of the world an impossible family. But its truth was undeniable, written on their faces. What she did next was not in any of her manuals. The law was clear, her duty prescribed. But the human heart has its own unwritten laws. She looked from the children to Elias, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a reclusive failure, but as a man who had been hollowed out by loss and had somehow, impossibly, found a way to be filled again. She saw the fierce love in his eyes, a love as real and solid as the ground beneath their feet. With a slow, deliberate movement, she closed the file in her hands. The click of the metal clasp was the loudest sound in the world. "I will file a report," she said, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier edge. "I will recommend a period of observation, a probationary guardianship, pending review." It was not a total victory, not a permanent promise. It was a reprieve. It was a chance. It was more than Elias had dared to hope for. She turned without another word and walked back to her car, her posture no longer quite so rigid. Sheriff Brody lingered for a moment, his gaze resting on Elias and the children. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of grudging respect before following her. The black sedan drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly back onto a world that was forever changed. That evening, the four of them sat at the kitchen table. The silence was gone. In its place was the comfortable sound of cutlery on plates, of a chair scraping slightly on the floor, of Caleb asking for more milk. Light from the setting sun streamed through the clean kitchen window, bathing the room in a warm golden glow. It illuminated the faded photograph on the mantel, not as a shrine to what was lost, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the past that had led them all to this present. After dinner, Lila went to check on her rose, which was now in full, glorious bloom. Samuel and Caleb helped Elias clear the table, their movements falling into an easy, familiar rhythm. Later, as dusk settled once more over the farm, Elias stood on the porch, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. He was not alone. The ghosts were still there. They would always be a part of him, but they were quieter now. They had made room. He felt a presence beside him and looked down to see Samuel standing there, looking out at the same sky. "Thank you," the boy said, the words soft but clear. Elias simply placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture that now felt as natural as breathing. He looked out at his land, at the farm that was slowly coming back to life, at the house that was once again a home. A single tear, hot and unexpected, traced a path through the ingrained dust on his cheek. It was a tear for all he had lost, for the years of silence and sorrow. But it was also a tear for all that he had found. It was the taste of a fragile, hard-won, and deeply profound hope. He had taken in 3 nameless children, and in the end, they had given him back his own name.